7 Spoons of Sugar, a Miss Marple Mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with something as simple as a cup of tea. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, afternoon tea is a daily ritual, polite conversation, delicate china, and just the right amount of sugar stirred gently into the cup. But when Miss Marple overhears someone casually mention a very peculiar habit, adding 7 spoons of sugar to their tea, the detail lingers in her mind. It seems harmless at first, until a sudden illness turns an ordinary visit into something far more troubling. As the village whispers about accidents and unfortunate timing, Miss Marple begins to notice the small inconsistencies others ignore: the sugar bowl placed a little too carefully, the teacup switched without explanation, and the unsettling truth that sometimes the sweetest things can hide the most dangerous intentions. Because in St. Mary Mead, even a spoonful of sugar can conceal a deadly secret. Before we discover why someone insisted on 7 spoons of sugar, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The First Spoon of Sugar. The village of St. Mary Mead liked to think of itself as a place where nothing truly dreadful could happen. The houses stood close together along narrow lanes bordered with neat hedges and quiet gardens. In the mornings the postman walked slowly along the road greeting everyone by name, and in the evenings a warm glow shone from cottage windows while kettles sang softly in tidy kitchens. To the outside world it appeared to be the very picture of peace. Yet Miss Marple had lived there long enough to know that quiet villages often hid their troubles better than noisy cities. Human nature was the same everywhere, and where people gathered, secrets followed close behind. That particular afternoon was warm and bright, with the gentle promise of spring in the air. Miss Marple sat beside the window of her small sitting room, knitting calmly while sunlight filtered through lace curtains and rested in pale golden shapes upon the carpet. A blackbird sang somewhere in the garden, and the scent of early flowers drifted faintly through the open window. The peacefulness of the moment suited Miss Marple perfectly. She had always enjoyed observing the world quietly while appearing to do nothing of importance at all. Her knitting moved slowly in her hands, though her sharp mind rarely rested. The silence was interrupted by the sudden click of the front gate and the quick sound of footsteps moving along the path. A moment later the doorbell rang with an urgent sharpness that felt strangely out of place on such a calm day. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose from her chair without hurry. Visitors often arrived in a state of excitement, she had learned, and it rarely helped matters if one appeared equally alarmed. When she opened the door she found Mrs. Elsie Hartwell standing on the step, her face pale and her breathing uneven as though she had walked far more quickly than usual. Mrs. Hartwell was a sensible and practical woman who owned the tea shop near the village square, and she was not known for nervous behavior. Yet at that moment her hands were clasped tightly together and her eyes carried the anxious look of someone who had spent hours worrying about something unpleasant. "Miss Marple," she said quickly, "I hope I am not disturbing you." "My dear Mrs. Hartwell, you never disturb me," Miss Marple replied in her gentle voice. "Please come in and sit down. You look quite troubled." Mrs. Hartwell stepped inside and followed Miss Marple into the sitting room, where the comfortable chairs and quiet atmosphere seemed to calm her slightly. Miss Marple poured fresh tea from the teapot that rested on the small table beside the window. The soft clink of the cup and saucer sounded almost reassuring. For a moment Mrs. Hartwell simply held the teacup in both hands as though the warmth helped steady her thoughts. Finally she spoke again, lowering her voice almost instinctively. "It is about Mr. Leonard Ashcroft." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted very slightly, though she said nothing at first. Mr. Ashcroft was a man known to everyone in the village even if few truly knew him well. He had arrived in St. Mary Mead 2 years earlier and purchased the large house at the edge of the village, a place that had stood empty for some time. People had expected him to become a familiar figure at local gatherings, yet he remained distant and private, polite but reserved. Rumors had formed around him naturally, as they always did when a wealthy stranger settled somewhere quiet. "What about him?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Hartwell took a breath that seemed to require some effort before she answered. "He died this morning." Miss Marple remained very still, her expression thoughtful rather than shocked. Sudden deaths were never pleasant, but she had lived long enough to know that tragedy often carried more explanation than people first believed. "That is sad news," she said quietly. "But why has it upset you so greatly?" Mrs. Hartwell leaned forward slightly in her chair, her voice trembling just enough to reveal the worry that had been growing inside her all morning. "Because I think something was wrong with the sugar." Miss Marple tilted her head in mild curiosity. "The sugar?" "Yes," Mrs. Hartwell said quickly. "Yesterday afternoon Mr. Ashcroft came to my tea shop. He sat at his usual table near the window and ordered tea just as he always did. Nothing seemed unusual at the time. I brought the tray myself, with a small bowl of sugar beside the teapot." Miss Marple listened without interrupting. "He took sugar," Mrs. Hartwell continued slowly, as though replaying the memory in careful detail. "One spoon, then another, and then another. I remember counting them without meaning to. 7 spoons in total. It seemed like a great deal of sugar, but some people have strange habits, so I did not think much about it then." Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "Indeed. Many people enjoy their tea very sweet. But that is not the strange part," Mrs. Hartwell said quietly. "After he left, I noticed the sugar bowl again while clearing the table. The sugar looked slightly darker than usual. I thought perhaps the supplier had sent a different batch. It did not seem important at the time." Miss Marple folded her hands gently in her lap. "And now?" she asked. Mrs. Hartwell's voice dropped even lower. "This morning the doctor announced that Mr. Ashcroft died from poisoning." The words hung in the air between them. Outside the window the breeze moved softly through the garden, yet the peaceful scene suddenly felt distant and unreal. Miss Marple remained silent for several seconds. Her calm expression did not change, but her mind had already begun its quiet work. "Poisoning," she repeated softly. "Yes. And now I cannot stop thinking about that sugar bowl." Miss Marple's eyes moved thoughtfully toward the teacup on the table as though imagining the scene in the tea shop. "Tell me carefully," she said after a moment. "Did anyone else use the same sugar bowl yesterday?" Mrs. Hartwell nodded slowly. "Yes, many people did. The bowl sits on the counter where customers can reach it easily. Anyone might have used it." Miss Marple considered this for a moment before asking another question. "And was Mr. Ashcroft alone when he visited your shop?" Mrs. Hartwell shook her head. "No. Several people were there at the time. Colonel Reeves was reading his newspaper by the door. Young Peter Collins stopped in for a slice of cake. And Mrs. Whitmore sat near the fireplace speaking with 2 friends." Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. A room full of witnesses often meant a room full of unnoticed details. "And did anyone approach Mr. Ashcroft's table while he was drinking his tea?" Mrs. Hartwell hesitated, thinking carefully. "Yes," she said at last. "Now that I remember it, 2 people spoke with him briefly. First Mr. Henry Barton, the solicitor. He stood beside the table for a moment, speaking very quietly. Then later Miss Clara Finch passed by and said something to him as well." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Miss Finch works at the post office, does she not?" "Yes, that is right." Miss Marple leaned back slightly in her chair, her mind turning over the information with gentle patience. 7 spoons of sugar. A crowded tea shop. A bowl that anyone could touch. And a man who had died only hours later. Mrs. Hartwell watched her anxiously. "You see why I came to you," she said. "The police may think it was an accident or some strange illness, but I keep remembering that sugar bowl. I cannot help feeling that something dreadful happened in my shop." Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile. "My dear Mrs. Hartwell, you did the right thing by coming here. When something unusual occurs, it is always wise to consider every possibility. But do you think it truly could have been poison in the sugar?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she stood and walked slowly to the window, looking out over the peaceful garden where the flowers swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. After a moment she spoke again in her soft, thoughtful voice. "Poison hidden in sugar would certainly be a clever method," she said. "Sugar dissolves quickly in hot tea. And if someone knew that Mr. Ashcroft always used a great deal of it, the plan would become even more effective." Mrs. Hartwell felt a chill run through her. "You mean someone might have planned it?" Miss Marple turned back toward her, her eyes calm but very alert. "My dear Mrs. Hartwell," she said quietly, "when a man takes 7 spoons of sugar and dies soon afterward, it is rarely wise to assume coincidence." Mrs. Hartwell swallowed nervously. "But who would want to kill him?" Miss Marple's gaze rested thoughtfully on the teacup beside the window. "That," she said gently, "is the question we must answer." Outside, the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead continued its quiet afternoon without the slightest idea that a small bowl of sugar had just become the center of a very dangerous mystery. And somewhere within that quiet village, a person who had watched Mr. Ashcroft stir his tea with 7 spoons of sugar might already be wondering whether their careful plan had truly worked. Chapter 2: The Second Spoon of Sugar. The news of Mr. Leonard Ashcroft's sudden death spread through St. Mary Mead with the quiet speed that only a village could achieve. By the following morning nearly everyone had heard the story, though each version sounded slightly different depending on who told it. Some said he had collapsed suddenly in his study. Others claimed the doctor had discovered poison immediately. A few insisted it must have been a natural illness. Yet beneath all the speculation there remained a shared uneasiness, because death in a village was one thing, but poison suggested intention, and intention suggested someone living among them who had planned it. Miss Marple spent that morning doing exactly what she always did when something strange occurred. She appeared to be doing very little at all. She walked slowly through the village, pausing occasionally to greet neighbors or admire a garden. To anyone watching, she seemed like an elderly lady enjoying a pleasant stroll. In reality, she was listening carefully and collecting the small details that people shared without realizing their importance. Her first stop was Mrs. Hartwell's tea shop. The familiar bell above the door rang softly as she entered, and the warm scent of baked bread and tea leaves filled the air. Mrs. Hartwell stood behind the counter looking tired and worried. When she saw Miss Marple, relief crossed her face. "I am very glad you came," she said quietly. Miss Marple smiled kindly and took a seat at one of the small tables. "My dear Mrs. Hartwell, I thought it might be helpful to see the place where everything happened." The tea shop looked exactly as it always had. The small tables were arranged neatly beside the windows, and the counter displayed cakes beneath glass covers. Nothing suggested that a man had drunk poisoned tea there only a day earlier. Yet Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly around the room, noticing every small detail. Mrs. Hartwell brought a fresh pot of tea and sat across from her. "The police came this morning," she said in a low voice. "They asked many questions about the sugar bowl. Miss Marple glanced toward the counter where the bowl now rested alone. "And what did they say about it?" "They took some of the sugar for testing," Mrs. Hartwell replied. "But the bowl had already been used by several people after Mr. Ashcroft left. If poison was there before, it might be impossible to prove now." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Quite understandable." She lifted her teacup slowly, though she did not add any sugar. "Tell me again who was here yesterday afternoon." Mrs. Hartwell repeated the list carefully. Colonel Reeves had been near the door reading his newspaper. Young Peter Collins had stopped for cake after finishing his work at the garage. Mrs. Whitmore had been sitting near the fireplace speaking with friends. Mr. Henry Barton, the village solicitor, had entered briefly to speak with Mr. Ashcroft. And Miss Clara Finch from the post office had also spoken with him before leaving. Miss Marple listened without interruption. Each name settled into her mind like pieces of a puzzle that had not yet formed a clear picture. "And did anyone behave strangely?" she asked at last. Mrs. Hartwell hesitated. "I am not sure," she said slowly. "Everything seemed normal at the time. But after thinking about it all night, I remembered something small." Miss Marple waited patiently. Mr. Barton looked rather tense when he spoke to Mr. Ashcroft. Their conversation was very quiet, but it did not seem friendly. Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. "Interesting." "And Miss Finch appeared upset when she left the shop," Mrs. Hartwell added. "Her face was pale, though I assumed she simply felt unwell." Miss Marple set her cup down carefully. "It is remarkable how many important details appear only after a little thought," she said gently. A moment later the bell above the door rang again, and Colonel Reeves entered carrying his folded newspaper. The retired officer greeted Miss Marple with polite surprise before ordering tea. Miss Marple greeted him warmly. "Good morning, Colonel. I believe you were here yesterday afternoon when Mr. Ashcroft visited." Colonel Reeves frowned slightly as he sat down. "Yes, I was. A terrible business. Poison, they say." "So I have heard," Miss Marple replied calmly. "Did you notice anything unusual while he was here?" The colonel thought for a moment. "Only that he seemed distracted. He kept stirring his tea for a long time. I remember thinking the man must enjoy sugar more than anyone I have ever seen." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "7 spoons, I believe." "Yes, that sounds right," the colonel said. Miss Marple hesitated before asking another question. "And when Mr. Barton spoke to him, did their conversation appear friendly?" Colonel Reeves shook his head. "Not particularly." Barton looked irritated, and Ashcroft did not seem pleased either. I could not hear the words, but the tone suggested disagreement. Miss Marple thanked him kindly and finished her tea. As she stepped outside a few minutes later, the quiet street of St. Mary Mead looked just as peaceful as always. Yet she felt certain that something important had happened in that small tea shop. Later that afternoon she walked past the post office and happened to encounter Miss Clara Finch locking the front door. The young woman looked nervous when she saw Miss Marple approaching. "Good afternoon, Miss Finch," Miss Marple said kindly. "Good afternoon." Miss Marple spoke gently, as though discussing nothing of importance. "I heard that you spoke with Mr. Ashcroft yesterday at the tea shop." Miss Finch hesitated before answering. "Yes, briefly." "Was he well?" The young woman looked down at her hands. "He seemed worried," she said quietly. "He asked if a certain letter had arrived for him. When I told him no, he appeared relieved." Miss Marple watched her carefully. "Relieved?" "Yes." Very much so. Miss Marple nodded slowly. A letter can sometimes cause a great deal of worry. Miss Finch gave a nervous smile before hurrying away. Miss Marple continued walking through the village with thoughtful steps. By the time she returned home, the afternoon sun had begun to fade behind the trees. She sat again beside her window with her knitting resting quietly in her lap. 7 spoons of sugar. A tense conversation with the solicitor. A missing letter. And a man who had seemed relieved that something had not yet arrived. Miss Marple's gentle expression remained calm, but her thoughts were becoming clearer with every passing moment. Somewhere within those small details lay the reason Mr. Leonard Ashcroft had died. And whoever had placed poison into that sugar bowl had believed the plan would pass unnoticed among the ordinary routines of village life. Yet Miss Marple had already begun to suspect that the truth might be hiding much closer than anyone expected. Chapter 3: The 7th Spoon of Sugar. By the following morning the quiet rhythm of St. Mary Mead had begun to feel slightly strained, as though the village itself sensed that something unpleasant was waiting to be revealed. People still greeted one another politely in the street, yet conversations paused when certain names were mentioned. Mr. Leonard Ashcroft's death had unsettled everyone more deeply than they cared to admit. Poison was not something that belonged in a peaceful village. Poison meant planning, and planning meant that someone among them had watched carefully, waited patiently, and chosen the right moment to act. Miss Marple spent the early part of the morning sitting beside her window with her knitting in her lap, though her needles hardly moved. She had been thinking quietly about everything she had learned during the previous day. The details were small, but they formed a pattern that reminded her strongly of other situations she had observed in the past. Human behavior, she often thought, followed familiar shapes if one looked closely enough. 7 spoons of sugar. That detail had seemed almost amusing at first, yet it had become the center of the entire mystery. Mr. Ashcroft had taken the sugar himself. The poison had not been forced upon him. It had been hidden somewhere he trusted completely. Miss Marple rose slowly and put on her coat. There was one more conversation she wished to have. Mr. Henry Barton's office stood near the edge of the village square. The brass nameplate on the door gleamed in the morning light as Miss Marple knocked gently. After a moment Mr. Barton opened the door, looking slightly surprised to see her standing there. "Miss Marple," he said politely. "How can I help you?" "I wondered if I might speak with you for a moment," she replied kindly. He hesitated only briefly before inviting her inside. The office was neat and orderly, with shelves of papers and law books arranged carefully along the walls. Mr. Barton motioned toward a chair while he remained standing beside his desk. "I imagine you have come about Mr. Ashcroft," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple answered calmly. "You spoke with him yesterday at the tea shop." Mr. Barton nodded. "It was a private matter." "I understand," Miss Marple said gently. "But I believe that matter may explain why he is dead." The solicitor's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Mr. Ashcroft was expecting a letter," she said quietly. A letter that worried him greatly. Yet when he learned it had not arrived, he appeared relieved. Mr. Barton said nothing. Miss Marple continued in the same calm voice. "I believe the letter concerned money. More precisely, I believe it concerned proof that some of Mr. Ashcroft's financial dealings were not entirely honest." The silence in the room grew heavier. "You were his solicitor," Miss Marple added. "Which means you would have known about those matters before anyone else." Mr. Barton's face tightened slightly. "That is speculation." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied. But yesterday in the tea shop you spoke with him about that letter. I believe he told you that if the letter ever arrived, he intended to reveal everything. Mr. Barton's hands rested firmly on the desk now. And what does that have to do with poison? Miss Marple's eyes were gentle but very steady. Because you knew something about Mr. Ashcroft that few others noticed. You knew he always added an extraordinary amount of sugar to his tea. 7 spoons, every time. The solicitor's expression remained controlled, but a faint tension had appeared in his shoulders. Miss Marple spoke softly. Poison placed directly into his cup might have been noticed. But poison mixed carefully into sugar would disappear the moment it touched hot tea. And if he used enough sugar, the taste would never reveal it. Mr. Barton said nothing. The bowl on the counter allowed anyone to reach it, Miss Marple continued. Yet only someone who expected Mr. Ashcroft to drink tea at that moment would risk placing poison there. You knew he would come. You had arranged to meet him. The room felt very quiet. For a brief moment, Miss Marple said gently, "You stepped away from the counter yesterday. Long enough to add a small amount of poison into the sugar bowl. You believed it would be impossible to trace afterward, because many people used that sugar." Mr. Barton's voice sounded colder now. "You cannot prove that." Miss Marple gave a small sympathetic smile. "Perhaps not directly. But the police have already discovered something interesting. A bottle of poison is missing from your office cabinet. The same poison the doctor found in Mr. Ashcroft's body." For the first time Mr. Barton looked truly unsettled. Miss Marple stood slowly. "You see," she said quietly, "you believed the sugar bowl would hide the truth. But you forgot one thing. People in villages observe habits very closely. Everyone remembered Mr. Ashcroft taking those 7 spoons of sugar." The solicitor lowered himself into his chair without speaking. Miss Marple moved toward the door. "I imagine the police will arrive shortly," she said kindly. "It would be wise to explain everything." She stepped outside into the quiet sunlight of the village square. The morning felt calm again, though the mystery had finally revealed its shape. Later that afternoon the story spread through St. Mary Mead with the same quiet speed as before. Mr. Henry Barton had confessed after the police searched his office. The letter Mr. Ashcroft feared would have exposed years of dishonest financial dealings between the two men. When Ashcroft threatened to reveal everything, Barton had chosen a desperate solution. And so the plan had been made around something as simple as sugar. Miss Marple returned home that evening and sat once more beside her window. The blackbird sang again in the garden as though nothing unusual had ever happened. Her knitting rested peacefully in her hands. Human nature, she reflected, rarely changed. Greed, fear, and desperation could appear anywhere, even in the most peaceful villages. But sometimes the smallest details reveal the truth. In this case, the truth had been hidden in something ordinary. 7 spoons of sugar. If you enjoy quiet mysteries where small clues reveal dangerous secrets, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who loves classic detective tales. And remember, in places that seem peaceful, the most surprising mysteries are often waiting quietly beneath the surface.